Okay, so thank you, India. So my name is Grace Western. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-head of advocacy at the Autonomy Institute and a steering committee member for the European Work Time Network. And I'll be moderating today's conversation, as I said, which is part of our monthly webinar series from the European Work Time Network. And for those of you who don't know who we are, the European Work Time Network is a pan-European network of policymakers, researchers, civil society organizations, and activists promoting work time reduction policies as a means to achieve more sustainable forms of production, more meaningful jobs, and a fair distribution of wealth. And our monthly webinars bring in multidisciplinary approaches around organizing, research, and policy work on the promotion of work time reduction. So for this month, I'm really thrilled to introduce today's speaker, which is Emma River Roberts, who is the founder and director of the Working Class Climate Alliance, an international advocacy nonprofit focused on working class rights and the greater inclusion of working class voices in climate spaces. Emma is also a PhD researcher at Goldsmiths University, whose research examines how a working class community in Sussex, England, is experiencing and responding to climate change. And just for awareness, so everyone can kind of manage their time, I think it's always helpful to know how we're going to spend the hour. Emma will probably share all of her brilliance with us for around 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll open up the second half of the hour for Q&A. So please feel free to jot down questions. Also feel free to drop them in the chat as you have them, and Indy and I will kind of collate them as we go along. So Emma, no pressure to look at the chat up until the Q&A, and I can read those questions out. So if folks are more comfortable in that format. But either way, I think we'll have a really generative and great discussion today. Okay, so with that, and we have more people trickling in, which is great. So we can kick off, and I'll hand it over to you, Emma, if you're ready to start.
Yes, thanks so much, Grace, and thank you to India as well for the invite to today, because this is a really important topic. And I thought I'd start by sharing my experiences in my early to mid 20s when I was doing shift work in call centers, and it was when I would have benefited from a reduction in working time sort of the most, because for the majority of that time, my health and well-being were pretty poor, and the pay was so low that I regularly had to do overtime to try and make enough money in order to get by. And even then, sort of some months I'd end up going further into debt because my wages didn't cover the bills. So most months I'd have probably between 50 and 75 pounds left over once all my bills were paid. So for me during this time, my entire existence was just centered around trying to make it to the end of the month. And all of this impacted how I spent my free time, which wasn't really free time at all. I had to work overtime, which meant that I'd be working through normally half of my lunch breaks, staying to work extra hours once my shift had ended, and sometimes working on one of my days off as well. And on top of that, poor transport links meant that I generally had to leave early to get to work and would often get home far later than I was actually supposed to because of how often transport delays and cancellations were. And that, was tiring enough as it was, especially when my shift pattern changed on a weekly, sometimes daily basis, meaning that I didn't have enough time to get used to different sleeping schedules. So, in instances where I was off work, a lot of that time was just spent resting and trying to catch up on sleep. And yeah, every now and then I'd sort of catch up with friends and go and do stuff every now and then at the weekends. But I almost always felt tired because of the mental exhaustion, the physical exhaustion, and the sleep deprivation that all of this brought on. And the same actually applied when I took holiday leave from work. Like a lot of the people I worked with, I'd use a lot of my holidays up doing nothing at home. Now, don't get me wrong, 10 years later, and I love spending days at home on the sofa like a potato, like watching TV, reading, or whatever. But the difference between then and now is back then I didn't really have much of a choice in the matter. I was so tired and burnt out that all I felt that I could do on my time off was rest. Oh, what?
We've got it. I've just made sure that we're muting everyone, so if everyone could stay on mute until the Q&A, that would be great. Sorry, Emma. Okay.
That's all right. The computers are fighting back. Um, and back then, reducing my working week would have been, an absolute dream, as it still would for so many people. And I shared my experiences because they're not unique, but they're pretty quintessential for shift workers and people working long hours. And like myself, workers have reported that these long hours and irregular, unpredictable schedules were the biggest obstacles to their well-being, all of which, is backed up by the research on how long hours impact workers' health. Now, the research sort of surrounding all of this is that the damage to health is most pronounced when working days last 10 hours or more, or when the working week exceeds probably about 48 hours. And they're associated with poor sleep quality, stress, anxiety and depression, smoking, injury at work. And in an interview with one Dutch care worker, they likened their long working week to an endless cycle of work and tiredness and having very little time to themselves. And to quote them directly, they said, you only really have the Sunday to yourself. And then you often have engagements, birthday parties, or things to do. Then it's Monday again, and you're basically exhausted just as you have to go back to work again. So there's, really no respite in this continuous circle. And this brings me sort of to class specifically because the costs of doing long hours are not distributed evenly. Now, if we're talking about class, we have to actually locate the working class. So we do need to sort of start by thinking about what exactly a class is. Now, that is to go in depth. That's an entirely separate conversation in itself. And it's something that will produce very different answers depending on who we speak to and where in the world that we are, including in the language used to describe it. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go too deeply into how we define class, nor am I sort of necessarily inviting category wars because I know debating classes are, sets people off, including me sometimes. But what I will say is this, is that at an everyday level, class relations are social and cultural as much as economic, playing out in how we engage with the people around us, and that's including in the workplaces. And if we view class only through its material dimensions, categorizing people by whether or not they sell their labour for wages, we end up with really uncritical depictions of contemporary class relations at this everyday level. And we're therefore left none the wiser about how to engage with different social groups or how to establish a sense of relatability with them. And we also need to bear in mind that class is intersectional by nature, so factors such as race, age, or gender may serve to empower or disempower us. And that's really key to bear in mind because often people use the working class, especially in the global north, as a shorthand to refer to white men working in industrial professions, and that's just not true. Because the workplace is a social world with its own hierarchies that are not just ranked by economic indicators. They are racialized and gendered. There are, cultures and unwritten codes, with people holding various degrees of influence over groups and how companies are run. And if we do treat everyone who sells their labour for wages as a homogenized block, then we do end up missing these internal dynamics, which ascertains who has power and who doesn't. And it's by reading these social and cultural dynamics, as I mentioned, that we can work out how to engage with the workplace in such a way that we're able to establish long-term, meaningful relations with the people in them. Now, it's also worth noting that we cannot rely on job titles alone to determine someone's class position in the present day. on the one hand, this is due to the increasing precaritization of employment across the world. So I'm doing a PhD in academia is a really notable example of this. You know, what was once seen as secure, well-paid employment is now, for an increasing amount of people, a life of precarious short-term contracts and or the looming threat of redundancy. And on the other hand, we have the existence of more privileged middle and upper middle class individuals choosing to live a life of downward mobility. So someone working part-time in a coffee shop on minimum wage might actually come from significant wealth. Now, in thinking about these sort of class and power relations in the workplace, I do find the concept of the professional managerial class, or PMC, really useful here. Now, I don't consider the PMC to be a class in itself, but I do think it's a really useful conceptual framework to help us understand these relations. So the PMC are defined as salaried workers who do not own their means of production, such as, managers. They maintain and service the working class in their labour roles, and in doing so, they facilitate the reproduction of capitalist culture and class relations by upholding and perpetuating its structures, values, and power dynamics. Now, for the people on the receiving end of all that managing, maintaining, and servicing, and there's quite a broad generalization. What is distinctive about the working class is their lack of power to change things in the workplace. They lack the wider networks and resources to improve conditions, such as knowledge of the law, the money to pay for legal challenges, and the people to rally behind campaigns and make a lot of noise about them. And as I said, going into the intricacies of what class is an entirely separate conversation in itself. And what I've just gone through is just to provide you with sort of a starting point in thinking about how class actually operates inside the workplace that we want to organise. It allows us to make this distinction as to who holds power over whom, who's likely to be on side with reducing working hours, and who's likely to be acting in the interests of the company in question. And this is where a note of caution comes in, that shorter hours only deliver benefits to workers if the conditions around them are right. We really need good socio-economic conditions at a broader level, because in the worst case scenario, implementing a reduction in working time can actually make the lives of workers harder in other areas. For example, the pressure to maintain existing workloads in a shorter amount of time, it can increase stress levels and effectively cancel out any positive gains that come with having an extra day off. And researchers also found that in one workplace even, it resulted in the stricter management of employees. So we really have to make sure that we consider what additional alterations need to be implemented in order to protect workers from the negative consequences of reduced hours. Now, the fact that actually implementing a reduction in working time can make the workplace a harder place to be in, it points to the need for having an organised, unionised workforce before anything else. And for good reason, right? So historically, its presence in workplaces has coincided with periods of trade union strength. So over the course of the 19th and the 20th centuries, a time period that saw a really strong union presence in a lot of areas across countries, workers did secure significant reductions in working time. But as the European Trade Union Institute points out, the stagnation of...
Bless you. Guess it was more of a cough.
I'm so sorry, I have hay fever, and this time of the year, it's brutal for me.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone needs to hear that. Okay. Right, back in the room. A time frame that saw, a strong union presence, as I just mentioned, workers did secure really significant reductions in working time. And as the European Trade Union Institute points out, the stagnation of a reduction in working time across workplaces and industries since the 1980s correlates with a widespread decline in union membership. It's not the only reason, but it was one of the big ones. And that's resulted in an increased difficulty in negotiating more favourable working conditions. Now, in unionising individual workplaces, it also means that demands can be tailored to the specific needs of each workplace, rather than taking a one-size-fits-all approach. So the Industrial European Trade Union points out that tailoring our approaches is vital to successful campaigns because there's multiple ways of introducing a reduction in working time. So shifting to a 4-day week is only one way of doing so. Alternatives can include, for example, starting later in the morning or starting later on certain days. Since I was asked to actually sort of give this talk today, I have tried it out and it's so good. So thanks, guys. I do sort of sometimes just take half days off. It's amazing. And Industrial also note that achieving this is best done through something called sectoral collective agreements. Now, these are the outcome of sectoral collective bargaining, which is the process of negotiation between trade unions and employers, where they work together to agree on employees' terms and conditions. So, for example, the hours worked each week, or when breaks and lunch breaks are to be taken, and how long these will actually be. Now, going through the collective bargaining route through this official formal process with trade unions, as opposed to informal chats with employers, does have several benefits. And that's notably that agreed terms are enshrined by law, which means that the employers can't just withdraw them out of the blue. Now, in instances where a reduction in working time will likely only succeed as part of a broader package of workplace reforms, we really need to know that going in and communicate this to workers that this will take time, if not several years, to achieve. And this will be true for many workplaces in industries that are already in desperate need of reform across virtually all areas, because their existing working conditions are just not set up to treat workers with dignity or to protect their physical and mental well-being from harm, such as the care industry, which is chronically understaffed. And as things stand right now, I'm sure that the majority of care workers would be on board with a reduction in their working week in principle, but they would rightfully be raising concerns about how their workplace would be able to cope if people were working fewer hours. So in the case of care workers, attracting and retaining them in Europe is really difficult for several reasons. Two really significant ones are low pay and excessive workloads. And this situation is even worse in Eastern Europe, where the pay is even lower, meaning that many workers head to the West in search of better paid roles. And that's left what's been referred to as medical desert. So that's areas where accessing care is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for some communities. And in instances, such as these, being able to actually go into workplaces with a firm understanding of what broader issues are in need of reform, such as recruiting more workers, is absolutely crucial to not only devising strategies that are successful, but also to gaining the trust of workers. Trust that this campaign is worth getting involved in, of lending their active support to it, but also trust that the people, so you guys or anyone else, actually knows what they're talking about. Now, of course, we probably won't know everything that needs to change until we engage with workplaces one-on-one. But going in with this kind of well-informed idea means that we can open with talking points that might speak to common concerns. So, for example, if I was looking to campaign or mobilise with care workers, I'd point to the fact that research on a 4-day week in the German public sector has calculated that a reduction in the working week would create an estimated 610,000 new full-time equivalent jobs. So as I mentioned, crucially, this informed understanding of a sector's wider issues allows us to set expectations with workers, and its implementation may rest upon the acquisition of broader reforms, such as securing the money to recruit and train additional staff. So while these foundations, these broader reforms are being laid, work time reduction may actually need to take a backseat for a while and treated as the overarching end goal instead of the immediate campaigning priority, which should be understood as a necessary stage of the process rather than a sign that the campaign isn't working. And being upfront about this from the outset really helps to uphold motivation and interest because people are effectively being told to expect to wait. And this clash between people's expectations versus the reality of making change is something that I've seen trip up campaigns several times over, because achieving collective goals can be quite a lengthy process with numerous hurdles to jump over. And when people expect to be able to jump over these hurdles with relative ease and rapidity, and these expectations aren't met, it can lead to groups becoming disillusioned and therefore disengaging from campaigning efforts altogether because they don't believe that making change for the better is actually possible. And alongside this, we have everything to learn from past campaigns in this area. They really help us to understand what's worked well and what hasn't. And they help to bring workers on board because seeing it done elsewhere shows that it's possible and that it's a tangible goal that they can win. So in 2018, IG Metall, which is the metal workers union in Germany, secured its members the right to cut their weekly hours from 35 to 28 for up to 2 years for those with family and caregiving responsibilities. And this win came after a series of 24-hour warning strikes that cost producers almost probably about 200 million euros even in lost production, with IG Metall threatening to ballot its members for extended industrial action unless working conditions improved. Now, if we fast forward to 2025, some employers in Germany's public sector have started arguing that staff shortages were the reason why the possibility of having more time off could be extended to workers in hospitals and social care. And since then, the pushback has spread from the bargaining table to the government itself. So in March of this year, it was reported that the government is seeking fundamental changes to the country's working time legislation. And despite union opposition, it wants to move away from the 8-hour day to weekly limits on working time, which could see a 13-hour day becoming standard in some industries. So these developments in Germany really do show how the same problems get turned against us. Governments and employers are exploiting existing structural issues, such as staff shortages, in order to justify their resistance to a reduction in working hours. But conversely, in better news, Iceland is proof that a reduction in working time can work at scale when it comes with a degree of cooperation from the government. So trade unions and grassroots groups had campaigned for a shorter working week for many years. And for the public sector union, BSRB, it had actually been a key objective since 2004. And they argued that cutting the working week was a really important part of creating a more family-friendly society based on the integration of family and professional life. Now, in 2014, in Iceland, a pilot was agreed to test cuts to working hours. And after a commitment from the Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs at the BSRB's 2015 conference, the union also secured a pilot on reduced working time in institutions operated by the central administration. And the results were really good, and agreements were won in stages over the years that followed. It was first in the private sector and then in the public sector. Shift workers did wait the longest, and their deal was signed only after industrial action had been threatened. But from, both sort of struggles in Germany and Iceland, it really was the unions driving the resistance, and they were getting it over the finish line. In times that successes were achieved, unions were absolutely integral to it. And in Iceland, the uptake across workplaces has been widespread. And by 2024, it was reported that close to 90% of the country's working population either work shorter hours or have the right to shorten their working week. Now, on the surface, it's been a really significant step, not only for workers' well-being, but also for gender equality. And that's something that applies to any cut in the hours people spend at work each week, no matter where they're based. But that isn't necessarily the reality for a lot of people, because we still have to ask what that time off actually consists of. So, worldwide, women remain the main caregivers, and for many of them, time away from paid work isn't free time at all, but actually a shift change into domestic labour and caregiving. And working class women can rarely outsource it by paying other people to care for their loved ones or clean their homes. So they end up shouldering the burden of caregiving and cleaning without additional help. And we can turn to the care survey to get an idea of just how unevenly this work is shared out. So it was published in 2024 by the European Union, by the European Institute for Gender Equality, and it covers 65,000 respondents across all 27 EU member states. And the survey notes that women carry the main burden of unpaid care, especially in terms of intensity, and are more often responsible for daily care and household routines. Women are also more than twice as likely as men to provide over 35 hours of childcare a week, and 82% of women do household chores at least 4 days a week, compared to 65% of men. And all of which, brings me back to this point that I've made throughout, the fact that shorter hours only deliver benefits to people if the conditions around them are right. This same cut in working hours in a workplace can mean free time for some and more unpaid work for others. A split that the survey's figures expose, and I will put the link to the survey in the chat because it's a really good read. And what it found was 68% of women and 55% of the men surveyed spend less than 8 hours a week on leisure activities, which, let's face it, is no time at all. So as the care survey notes, and I completely agree, we need economic protections for caregivers, as well as a cultural shift that challenges gender norms so that women and men can share care and housework more equally. And, these issues can apply to anyone really, whether they work in blue or white collar roles. But unless we see these broader reforms, it is the working class who run the risk of seeing the least improvement to their livelihoods, and they may even end up experiencing a life of greater stress. So to round off here, I'd like to stress that achieving a reduction in working time only delivers benefits to people if these broader conditions are right. Because, let's put it put it lightly, society is an absolute mess right now. There is a lot that we need to change, and we'll only know what would be of benefit to workers once we engage with them directly. So going in with a pre-packaged campaign idea just won't work. And at the start of, the talk, I shared my experiences, what I would have needed back then. 10 years ago, it's not just a reduction in working time, but also a pay rise. But some of the changes that we need to make sit beyond the workplace altogether, such as challenging the cultural norm that women should be the main caregivers. Now, these conditions are set by power, but they are conditions that can be resisted and reshaped for the better by power and solidarity. And that's above all through trade unions, organised workplaces, as well as the feminist and grassroots movements fighting for change beyond them. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. I'm doing a virtual clapping for you, as I'm sure other people are as well. Thank you, Indy. Yeah, I mean, so much of that was so interesting. The shorter hours only deliver benefits if the social conditions are right. I really jotted down that note. Um, because it's so true. Okay, great. Also, I hope that you're feeling okay. I know that the allergies are terrible this time of year. Okay,
Yeah, I
great.
hope it wasn't too
Oh
distracting.
no, no,
Sorry.
no, 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 not at all.
Oh, it's
Not at
okay.
all. Absolutely not at all. Just thank you. Okay. And the other thing I was going to know is especially what you were talking about for care workers specifically. I know in Portugal they had a successful pilot of a shorter working week in a nursery. I think Sophia Cruz might be able to say more about that if people are interested. But yes, completely agree that until you're doing it, kind of the conditions that workers need and how we're approaching that specifically for care workers and understanding our relationship to care outside of paid labor um, is very important. Okay. Anyone like to drop questions in the chat or feel free to raise your hand either with the Zoom function or if that's you'd rather do it in the screen if you turn your camera on. Um, I can get folks in, and if no one wants to start right off the bat, I always have many questions, so I can kick us off. But please, yes, feel free to drop your questions in the chat and we can read them out. Um, Emma, I guess I'd be curious to hear more about because I know you're working with a lot of people and organizing a lot of people with lived experience. Um, and I would just love to hear more about kind of that, how you see, we talked about the role of trade unions and how important that is, but just kind of in your work in organizing, kind of what kind of that best practices and kind of what energizes people the most kind of towards working time reduction.
I would say it's organizing around workload and dignity and not just sort of time and money as sort of economic indicators because it allows us to go in with a values-based approach to people. And we can talk about those uh, commonalities that we might have across political differences, across ideological differences, and say we all love spending time with our families, our loved ones. We all have hobbies that we like to do, no matter what they are. I think everyone has at least one hobby. And it would be really great if we all had time to pursue them and just have time to rest. And that is so helpful because it kind of cuts through, I think, the antagonistic side of it when people go, oh, this is just a really stupid lefty thing or something. We can actually say to people who are right leaning that actually, no, this is of benefit to everyone. It's not just some agenda. But also, pointing to I don't want to say the benefit to COVID lockdowns because it wasn't it wasn't really a positive thing, but there was a widespread shift to working at home, despite loads of employers saying that they could never do it. And at the time, I was actually working in a call center, and I remember people had asked this before. It's like, can we work from home? They're like, no, 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 it will never work. You have to come in every day. And then they somehow managed it within a week. It turns out they had a contingency plan. We were like, oh, okay, okay. But there was this huge, it's been all over the news during the time and it's continued since, with people saying, well, actually, I don't like commuting to work every day. And now I've found out I don't have to do it because I can have my breakfast in the morning. I don't have to rush. I can spend time with my kid. I can pick them up from work. And I think it's, yeah, going in with the values-based approach, but also leaning on the past couple of years and saying there's been this huge shift. It is actually possible. And as we've seen, people from the left to the right of the political spectrum really benefit from it. There's so many testimonies out there. And that allows us, I guess, to shift the topic of conversation over to power and say this is an issue with your employer. This isn't, you know, anything else. Especially because it turns out that a lot of employers want people back in the workplace because they've paid really ridiculous amounts of money for buildings and they, have to make use of it. And that's, yeah, that allows us to go into a much, I guess, easier conversation about I'm gonna say this is us and them, but it doesn't have to be like antagonistic or going with like a class war approach. It can be like your employer could treat us better. Like,
Great. Thank you so much, Emma. Also, just going to say that India dropped in the link to our February 2025 webinar on the 40 week in a nursery. So if people are more interested in that, not more, if you are interested in talking about that more, is where I put use meant to put the more, the link is right there. I'm also gonna elevate a question from Jenny in the chat, and then Sophia, I'll come to you next. So Jenny said that for marginalized members of the working class, disabled, transient, racially minoritized, etc., whose lives may be at the more precarious end of the spectrum, how can class solidarity help us achieve these changes when power and money can be leveraged against us, and particularly in industries or areas where there is no trade union to join? Also, Jenny, don't worry about your mic. It's all good.
in terms of achieving class solidarity and fighting back that power and money that has been leveraged against us, is one-on-one community engagement cuts through all of that. And we first have to be prepared for the fact that we might get slightly hostile responses at first. It's not always easy. People can be a little bit suspicious, like, why are you coming into my workplace, my community? What do you want? So it does take patience. But when we speak to people, we're able to sort of cut through that anonymous online depersonalization that happens so much. I think Twitter or X or whatever is probably the worst example of that in action. It's so, I mean, I don't really use it anymore. It's so salacious. But when we actually spend time with people, and we're not just talking about doing workshops or doing formal talks, but sometimes just going for a pint or arranging an event where people can eat food, where people can drink, where there's music, and people can relax and get to know each other as people rather than as organizers. And I think that's a really, really key way to start. So we are doing a campaign with one of the trade union branches of Unison in the UK, up in the north, in East Leeds. And how we're starting is that we're saying, well, let's not go in and start talking to people about climate change, about reducing working time, about any sort of class struggle or anything. We're just going to set up a series of social events because we want people to feel welcome. And we also want people to know that it's somewhere that they can relax and it's kind of a safe space for them. Now that's much easier said than done. First of all, it takes resources and money, time, and especially with activist time, if we are going down the activist route, rather than through a job that pays us to do it. Um, there's no money in that, and we all need money to live. Um, so for that, what I'd really recommend is actually reaching out if there's any local groups in the area. They don't have to be trade unions. And saying, is there anything that we can actually help you with? Because they may have some more resources, and then we can go down the route of mutual aid where people are sharing it. And in terms of places where there's no trade union presence, what I'd recommend, and there'd be a fair amount of work in it, is basically finding out if there's where's your closest trade union, and actually speaking with them and asking them to come in to the community to speak to people might help. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much, Emma. Um, Perfect. Great. Sophia, I'm gonna pass it over to you now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Emma, for your interesting talk. I'm involved in for the week experience, especially in Portugal. So your talk really resonates with me. And my question is about this. In these trials, we tend to measure success through leisure and well-being indicators, as you know, that are often designed around a middle-class experience of free time, in fact. So I was wondering if you could talk about what a general class-sensitive metric of time redistribution would actually look like for these trials. considering these class differences. And as you are also an academic, you told that you are conducting your PhD dissertation. Maybe we are involved also in this theoretical debate. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about class-sensitive metric of time in this trial that we are conducting worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you. Big question. And yeah, it's the thing about academics, I don't know, we love to learn, but we also love to debate, even with ourselves. So I've just gone through a big piece of work where I've just argued with myself in the text, and my supervisor was like, what the fuck are you doing? But anyway, I guess a class sensitive sort of measure of time would be access to broader amenities in the community. So things like actually getting to the doctors on time, having public transport that's accessible and available. So I was in Wales a couple of years ago, and the community were like, we want to reduce our emissions, the working class community, but we have one bus an hour and it's often late, and sometimes it doesn't show. We don't have access to a supermarket. We've just got a little corner store, and the shopkeeper's very nice, but it's also very expensive. So we feel completely cut off from the main town. They're actually on the outskirts of Cardiff. And in the centre of Cardiff, there is so, I don't drive, and I was able to access everything I needed there, right? But actually going out to where they lived, it was like being in a different part of the country. It was so deprived of resources. So I would say, in terms of we think about well-being, it's how do we meet those basic needs with ease. So as I say, it's things like transport, getting to the supermarket, getting to the doctors, even to the vets. So I've got vets in my mind because I took my cat to the vet this morning. All of those things that if people can drive, or if people live in more built up areas, they don't really have to think twice about. And I think in the UK, there was this idea of the 15-minute cities, and they were saying you should be able to walk to everywhere that you need to get by in your daily life, like ideas I just mentioned, in 15 minutes. But then we experienced a lot of pushback to it because there's a lot of conspiracy theories saying that you're trying to control us and keep us in our towns, and they were like, what's wrong with you? So yeah, as I say, the access to these amenities, but also to values. So family time, dignity, in everyday society is a big one, because I don't I'm not too clued up on class relations and classism in Portugal. I don't know if there's kind of the same relationship to class where people are disadvantaged for how they speak, behave. Oh, it is. Oh, okay, yeah. Then I'd say, yeah, also dignity and how people are treated in everyday society, because classism and how working class people are marginalized just for existing, just for their habits, is something that is overlooked all the fucking time. And if we're doing a middle class well-being survey, I was like, well, that's not going to be included. But yeah, that definitely needs to be in there as well.
That was really helpful. Thank you so much, Emma. I'll turn to Tatiana next, and then I will go to the folks in the chat.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Emma. This was so interesting and such an important topic. I wanted to kind of react and ask you a question, just more like, I guess, just an extension of one of the things you said. So that point around working time reduction only bringing benefits if the social conditions are right, which I agree with, obviously, and particularly, but I would make basically a slight distinction. I want to ask you back that question. So I think it's absolutely true. And from what we see also in pilots, and we implement this in organizations, particularly when it comes to workplace implementation. And so the kind of conditions that are paired with working time reduction when it's implemented in the workplace, particularly if it's paired with harmful managerial practices or no actual actually thought through way of reorganizing work around it, no actual consideration of the existing structural challenges that already exist in a lot of sectors. And I think that can be absolutely really harmful and should be avoided at all costs. But in terms of particularly kind of the gender angle that you mentioned and the way that this can impact the second shift in particular, although I agree, obviously, that this is not going to, on its own, right, like rebalance gender relations. We also hear from people who tell us that even in ways that weren't expected, women are still performing more domestic work or care work than men, but it's less stressful, it's a bit less intense because they do have more time, or they do get for the first time a little bit of what is sometimes called me time or kind of actual free time, which you were referring to, which they didn't have access to before, for example. And so I'm just saying that just to say that basically we also see that in cases where it's absolutely not perfect, and it's not implemented in kind of the way that we would prefer to see, it's still providing relief in ways that can be really transformative to people's lives. And yeah, like the caveat to that is that most of the organizations that we work with are white collar workers organizations. And so I wanted to ask you back, do you think that's true across classes? And obviously there will be differences, right? So it won't be the same, but I wonder if there is still, and from the campaigning perspective, like sort of a pragmatic take of even if it's not great, it's still better, provided it's not, again, done in a harmful way in the workplace itself, than nothing. And can also be a way to support broader kind of organization in communities as well, by giving people that time back. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I mean, it's great to hear that, as you say, it's not perfect, but it's an improvement and it's a place to start and build on. And I think there is a class difference in that still, especially if we're talking about blue collar work where it's, I guess, precarious shifts or they don't have access to good public transport, or anyone that can really sort of help them in sort of their spare time with anything. That is still, I'd say, moving stress from one area to the other. But from speaking to people, I feel that the stress is still reduced. So although it's still not perfect and we still need to make noise about it, we should absolutely be going down that route and saying, this is where we start. And we will build on that to challenge those cultural norms, but also to ensure that people have access to that broader infrastructure that working class communities often lack. Now, at the moment, not necessarily true of everywhere, but in England, we are really struggling with the heat because our houses are built to retain heat, which is great. It's another reason to live in England. And people are saying, well, actually, I'm going to work because the building is air-conned. So we also need to think about actually what the home's like itself, because there's no cool spaces around me that people can go to. There's one, but it's not always open, and we appreciate it, but it's not going to help people all the time. But then I'd say as well, there is an additional risk of pushing the cost onto racialized care workers. And this is something that Bell Hooks actually wrote about when she was talking about the feminist movement and struggle in the US last century. There were a massive increase in white middle class women going out to work, and obviously that is good for gender equality, but it meant that Black domestic workers stayed in the home and their wages didn't increase, their hours increased. So I think if we're thinking about the same lines of who might actually be picking up the cost of looking after children or people, we do have to think as well, we don't want to inadvertently push that onto sort of migrant workers as well. But yeah, as I say, definitely still a place to start, and it's a positive place to start. So.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, like have so many little notes that I'm taking as you speak, Emma. Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions. So I'm going to take Sari's question in the chat, and then if anyone else has one they would like to raise their hand or drop in the chat as well, feel free to. Siri says in the chat, thanks, Emma, for your fascinating talk. Could you say more about how shift workers have been included in work time reduction trials, specifically perhaps the Iceland example you mentioned and what had to be overcome? or any reading recommendations on this. I would also say I think it's a European Trade Union Institute paper from Agnieszka Piasna, and I'm not sure the other author. There's a co-author that talks about shift workers in Italy in the manufacturing sector. So that is something that I know that I've definitely read, that I can send over to you, Sari, as well. So I'm not sure if that's helpful, but just thought I'd preface that, Emma, before you jump in.
What paper did you say? Because I think it's the same one.
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the ones that talk. It's the European Trade Union Institute paper with Agnieszka Piasna talking about shift workers in automobile manufacturing plants in Italy.
Oh, okay. No, I misheard you. No, this one, and I'll put it in the chat. It's by the European Public Service Union,
Oh, okay, great.
and it was a series of case studies from across Europe about reducing working time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really, really helpful actually to sort of see how sort of people did it, how the pilots worked. Let me just first of all put that in the chat. But there was it was a bit harder for shift workers to actually get it through, and the reason is employers were saying, well, how do we actually account for people being in work at different times? And it was, I think it was one or two, and I cannot remember off the top of my head. If anyone knows, please actually jump in. I can't remember off the top of my head how many years. I think it was years later that shift workers did achieve some sort of win in that. What I can speak about in terms of just a bit more detail in how shift workers have actually been included in trials was actually a place that I used to work at, and I think it is a good example. It was in the last call center I worked at before COVID and lockdown, and it was a voluntary scheme for people who had caring responsibilities. Um, now I would say there was actually a little bit of tension that emerged from that because people were saying, well, just because I don't have kids, am I being punished? I'm stuck here. It sucks here. Um, and that was something that I think people have to really factor in when we're looking at communicating that to people. But the way that people were surveyed and fed information back was actually through a survey. And I think that was quite good because it allowed people to provide honest feedback anonymously. And we know that if we're trying to get any sort of struggle through with any employer, there can be a bit of tentative engagement because people are like, well, if I say something bad about my employer, they're going to, sack me, or I'm going to get reprimanded for it. So in terms of successfully engaging shift workers, I would really promote and encourage people to look for ways that they can, give good and bad feedback anonymously. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Emma. Yeah, I think that's something that I think we've definitely stumbled across in our work at Autonomy too, that anonymous feedback is really important when looking at things like this. And I think, yeah. So great. Okay. Also, multiple people have dropped in relevant links to some reports that touch on shift work more generally, which is really great. And also, thank you to Tony, who dropped something in about trade unions from October onwards will have a legal right to request physical or digital access to workplaces to recruit, organize, and represent workers. So if you're UK based and or just interested, feel free to click on that. I'm not seeing any final questions, which is great. I mean, it's not great. People can ask questions whenever they'd like, but I just meant great timing. Look at all of us. We're focused on work time. We're managing our time. Look at it go. Um, okay. So I think then we will wrap up. I mean, Emma, thank you so much. This has been really such a wonderful conversation. I personally feel like I've learned so much, and hopefully, the audience feels the same way, but I gather they do based on all these great questions. And I just want to, briefly say that our next European Work Time Network webinar is in September, and it's about strategic coalitions and hybrid framing the 4-day work week with public policy. So that will be the 16th of September at 1 p.m. with Associate Professor Joan Sanchez. So that's our next one. We'll basically be taking August off because it is summer, and hopefully, speaking of work time reduction, other people have some holidays ahead of them. We will also be having the European Work Time Network members event in Porto on the 25th of September, and the event will take place at the University of Porto in Portugal. Thank you, Sophia Cruz, on the second day of their international conference on working time reduction. So if you haven't looked that up already as well, really great speakers and great conversations will be had. So if you haven't already signed up, fill out their EOI form in the chat that Indy, I'm sure, has either dropped in or will drop in shortly. And we can share additional information about both the conference event and also our members event. Okay. I think those are all the pieces of information, and we're right on time. So Emma, truly, thank you so much. It's been great to have you, and really appreciate everyone being here today. And I hope everyone stays cool. Air quality is okay. Thinking of everyone as we navigate the climate crisis. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you. Have a nice summer. Bye.
Yes, thanks, Sophia. You too.
Bye.